Welcome to the Tall Corn Book Talk. I'm Nick Bergus, the books columnist for the Iowan magazine. And with me, as always, of course, is Steve Semken, the publisher of Ice Cube Press. How are you doing today, Steve?
I'm doing great. It's not too cold, but it's definitely winter. We've got snow on the ground.
Absolutely. But you're right, it is above zero. It's above 20 now, which is great. So let's get into some recommendations. What do you have for us today that you think we should read?
Well, let me think. It's a few good books, so I always bring too many books. But this time I thought, one, I didn't watch the Super Bowl, but I heard there's this great commercial about this farm. Well, I don't know if it was great. There's a commercial about a farmer in a truck. And I thought, well, that's great, except that in Iowa we have this great history of writing about farms and farmers. And I was thinking about that, and I thought the complete collection of poetry of James Hurst, who's a old poet who lived up in Cedar Falls area and has the Hearst Center for the Arts named after him. But there's some really remarkable references to what I would call sort of more like real life farming is going on there. So I thought that's pretty good to sort of relate back to our Iowa heritage and farming and that sort of thing.
And that's edited by a guest that we've had on the show.
Oh yeah, Scott Quilty, right.
Yeah.
He wrote Brother's Blood.
Yep,
right.
And we had him on a few episodes ago.
That's right, I forgot about that.
Yeah, what else do you have?
This one I picked up at the sort of like the books of the year, and it's called The Art of Fielding. And at first I really didn't know what that referred to, and then it dawned on me it has to do with baseball, but it has to do with a lot more than baseball. It's this great, it's one of those novels that really takes you deep into the characters, every ounce of their being. You learn what they think about all sorts of things in life, and it's a real captivating, long novel that I was surprised to enjoy as much as I did, and at the end I'm trying to tell everybody about it. And don't get wrapped up in just baseball. It's a lot more than that.
So is this a book that baseball fans and non-fans alike would get into?
Yeah, I think, because it starts, I mean, the premise is this kid is a really great baseball player and he never makes mistakes. And then he's taken on by sort of a mentor, older student in college who tries to increase his ability to become a professional baseball player. But along the ways he starts he has doubts about how good he is. And then there's relationship issues, and the guy that's mentoring him to become successful turns out to have his own problems. And so it's a real, I'm not going to say page turner, because you don't want to keep turning the pages. You really enjoy each sort of aspect of the story. And so I just thought it's cool because it's not just a sports story at all. Sort of sports is integrated into it.
Sports is the backdrop.
Right.
That's great. What else do you have?
Well, I was starting to think about, I listened to this radio show called On Being, and there's this show with this Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And I've only really thought about him before because this great quote called, "The opposite of hate isn't love, it's indifference." And that's the only thing I've ever heard that person say. And I haven't enjoyed that comment, but I've always taken that to heart. And so a lot of times I'm like, I need to be more indifferent to this thing. And I've listened to talk about him, and I was more inspired to learn more about Abraham Heschel. And so far I'm learning a lot about Jewish heritage and Jewish traditions here in the United States, and also a lot more about Rabbi Heschel as well. And so I recommend it as someone that really wants to get into a fairly deep biography of a religious person's lifestyle. Should I keep going?
Please do.
All right. Well, I'm going to continue on with the spiritual aspects of life, because this is a lady that I just love listening to on the radio, Tara Brach, and she's a meditation Buddhist specialist, and she is really, I've always enjoyed listening to her weekly radio shows, and she has this new book called True Refuge. And for those into, maybe it's a wintertime thing where I'm into sitting down and getting deep into the light's not so bright in the evenings, getting into spirituality and meditation and whatnot. Finally, Iowa City hosts this great thing called the One Book, Two Book Show for kids, and we just got done with that. And a lot of the parents and children in Iowa City were really happy to see one of my authors, Jeanette Hopkins, who's been visiting Iowa City schools almost nonstop for maybe 2.5 years.
That's great.
And she started out with the juggler, with the Ladybug Waltz, and she's been going to lots of schools and preschools in the area. And so this is her first book by Iowa City artist in combination with Heidi Goken, who's the art teacher over at Penn Elementary.
In North Liberty. That's
in North
great.
Liberty. And so kids have really, I mean, when she was at the show this time, lots of kids were just running up, it's Jeanette Hopkins. She did the Ladybug Waltz, and she also did this one called the Juggler. And they're both, obviously, as you can tell, picture books for kids.
Yeah.
But as I always say, picture books aren't just for kids anymore. They're for anyone that wants to learn more about how to use words and more to how to tell stories and more just creativity in general.
Well, and the thing too is a good storybook has to work on two levels, right?
Oh,
it has
absolutely.
to, like, because I as a parent am reading these books oftentimes
Right.
with my daughter, like, and if it's a book that she likes but I hate,
Right.
like that is not
You're
going
like,
to get us
we're not
anywhere.
reading this, at least with the words that are in the book.
Better that I be indifferent than that I hate it.
Right. Well, I've heard her do this, both of these before, and you realize that the teachers really do know more than they. I mean, the book seems so simple on that one level, like you said, and the other level it's not, because she'll always go over. Well, I think she uses the word turquoise or a different word for blue, and every time she gets to that choice, she's like, why did I not use blue, or why do we not always use the word blue? How can we improve, or how can we get better meaning off of different words? And so that's really cool to hear someone just say that out loud to a kindergartner or first grade, and they're like, oh yeah, there's lots of ways to say the same thing apparently, but there's so many rich words that you can use.
Well, since you brought in the Juggler, which you worked on with her, I'm curious. I think people tend to have this idea that writing for kids is really easy, and my suspicion is that it's deceptively simple.
Right.
What kind of choices do you have to help a children's author sort of work through?
Well, I think the first thing is that I get a lot of books sent to me, and I think that they think that it is easy, and so they send you these ridiculously, obviously stories that it's like in their mind they think, oh, kids can't possibly have any discerning ability to figure out a good story from an easy one. So there's always wizards, or there's always these stereotypical things that happen. And so Jeanette has not really done that. She's used her background in reading and in teaching kids to realize that in a picture book, for instance, you want to have, there's the story that's being read, and there's also the things hidden in the trees of the drawings, or there's also the consistency of the character's appearance, and there's patterns that go into it. And so it's not just, because I know I tried to write a children's book once, and man, it was so dumb. In my mind, I literally thought, I'll just throw some wizards in there, and we'll have a good ending, and everyone will think it's great, and I'll have exciting fantasy things happen.
Yeah.
And really, that's not how it goes. It's kind of like kids when you feed them food. It's like, kids don't inherently like food that tastes bad, like ground up peas.
Yeah.
I mean, if you offer kids food that tastes better, they're of course going to like that food that tastes better. And so I think it's the same thing with words and stories. It's not the simplest thing, is not what people are kids are drawn to.
Yeah.
So that's sort of what we were. I mean, I've just been lucky that she sort of knows what she's doing ahead of time, and I don't really have to do anything except figure out where words are placed on a page, or try and figure out page breaks and how to carry the story through the book. Sometimes more of a trick than you might think, sort of poetry style. Mind frame.
Great. Well, you've talked about a couple of sort of spiritual books. We're going to talk to Bob Sessions, Becoming Real. He wrote that for you, and he's a native of South Dakota. He got his BA from Drake, his PhD.
Probably like our smartest person we've ever had, except for you, of course.
Oh, of course. He got his PhD in philosophy from Michigan, and he's been teaching for nearly 3 decades at Kirkwood here in Iowa City. Right. Thanks for coming by, Bob.
Well, my pleasure. Happy to be here.
Great. Tell us a little bit about sort of what Becoming Real is about.
The subtitle is Authenticity in an Age of Distractions. And it's a kind of capstone book for me of my 45 years of teaching and doing philosophy and so on. Meant for a educated lay audience. It's not just for philosophers, or perhaps not even for philosophers. It's an attempt to weave together a lot of different sort of topics and areas that I've studied. I've got a chapter on nature and our relationship to nature, and how our alienation from nature that happens in many ways is part of why people have authenticity crises in our culture. I have a chapter on work. In many ways, the same sort of thing. If we don't have good work, it's very difficult to be an authentic human being, because we spend much of our day doing something that doesn't fit us. It doesn't help us become and be real. And I've got a chapter on technology, which is also increasingly a source of people's difficulty in finding their voice and being who they might be, because the technology tends to lead us instead of us using it and leading it.
So when you sort of define real, what do you mean by that?
Well, there are many different views of authenticity. First of all, authenticity is a problem for us in the modern world in ways that it's not for people in previous kinds of societies. Based on our individualism, based on our communities being much less tight, on families not being so central, on people's mobility, diversity of cultures, and so on. You know, when you live in a small-scale culture where everybody's the same and you grow up with everyone and so on, your identity is set. Okay, so becoming authentic is not even an issue that makes any sense. Whereas for us, on the positive side, our freedom allows us, our freedom to be mobile and make all these choices, allows us to pick and choose. But the downside is we have to. And forming an identity is a very difficult thing. And if you don't have a pretty good idea of what's involved in it, you can go awry very easily. And so I think that's part of what the book is about, is trying to help people get clear on just what authenticity is, so people can begin doing the construction that's required, because it's not a given at all.
Yeah. So what are some of the dangers of being inauthentic?
Well, I think the deepest danger really is that people finally become depressed, people sort of spin out of control in various ways because what they're doing doesn't fit who they are and who they might be. Their deepest and highest potential has never been discovered or materialized, just hasn't happened.
Yeah, I know. There was a couple things. I remember when I first started going to college or out of high school, and I remember walking along the Iowa River, and it dawned on me at some point. I mean, I remember thinking I could do almost anything I wanted to do, and so I felt like that was kind of cool for about 22 seconds or so. And all of a sudden, it dawned on me, oh crap, I actually can do just about anything I want to do. And so at that point, it dawned on me, just like you're saying, that wait, it would have been much easier. Well, I don't know if it would have been more satisfying, maybe easier if someone said, you know, you will go into this business and that's just what you're going to do.
Yeah.
And then it would have been whether I took the challenge to be the best I could at that or not.
Right.
And then I was also thinking, and then, so then I think people will also decide what it is they want to do, and if that doesn't happen, that can also be really traumatic also, because you sort of have in your mind, I'm going to go from A to B. That doesn't always work, and so your idea of reality is thrown out of whack entirely, and you're thrown like, well, if I can't be a teacher like I always wanted to be, then what's going to happen next? And so becoming real is everywhere around us in a certain way.
Yeah, no, it's a kind of identity crisis that people have, and as you say, on the one hand, it's an opportunity, but it can also be a curse. The French philosopher Sartre invented a phrase to refer to the difficulty called bad faith. And to live in bad faith is to pretend that you're one thing and be another, but it's also the burden of having to make every choice about our identities every moment of every day. It's, you know, nothing is given.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very difficult.
I'm starting to get overwhelmed right now. I actually kind of thought it was being
Well, another part of this is that a lot of people say, well, I just have to get in touch with what I desire. Well, the problem is that our desires are conditioned. They're conditioned by the world around us. The major trick, for example, of capitalism and consumerism is to convince people that it's all about them. That they're individuals and they can be anybody they want to be and so on. And then you tell them, well, the only way you can really be real, the only way you can be valuable, the only way you can be noticed and recognized and so on, is if you wear this, drive this, smell like this, use this product, and so on.
Right.
And so your desires then become desires that have been implanted. Now that's not new, okay? That's not new, and that's part of the problem. A lot of people think that authenticity has to do with finding the true me that's hidden deep down inside. And so to be a full human being, I have to shed all of my social relationships and culture and so on. And my book is an attempt to sort of see how those two things come together, nature and nurture. That indeed, we do have certain kinds of orientations that we're born with, and so on, and we also are cultural beings. We wouldn't be human persons if we weren't encultured. We'd be wolf boys, and so on. And so how do those come together in a complex way? And there are no two people alike, of course, but you don't want to throw away some of the major ingredients that might be a part of your authenticity, that have to be, that you get from your culture and your society. At the same time, you don't want them to totally dictate in a way that you ignore your natural inclinations and talents and so on.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, we've obviously had on the show, we've had poets and we've had nonfiction authors and we've had fiction authors. How is writing, how do you sit down and write a book about philosophy? And what's your process?
Yeah. Well, in some ways, it's like most any kind of scholarship it was for me, and that's that I took a look at it, what's been said about it, a lot of literature review. But because the book, as I said, was a kind of capstone book, and it pulls together things from a lot of different areas, I couldn't simply look at a narrow band of research, which is what people typically do in scholarly books. And so I was, listening to a lot of different notes at the same time. I finally decided on a chapter structure. That was important to figure out, what my sub-themes were. But then my writing process, I don't know how many people write this way. I've never really talked to many people about it, but I almost every day would sit and write some. And sometimes, of course, you write and it's not there. But to a great extent, it really flowed. But every day I would go back through what I had written on that sub-theme and work it over again and launch me then into the next few pages. And the next day I'd go back to the beginning of those pages. And by the time I'm done, I've got 50, 60 pages on that theme that I've gone over many times. So, I think a lot of people write it straight through and then go back and revise. But mine was a daily revision process.
How was working?
You're the envy of all writers then. Every writer wants to write every day, but I don't know that they do.
Yeah.
But
well, I didn't write every day. I was teaching 5 classes while I was writing. Okay.
To build upon itself is actually, I think that's the best way to do it. I mean, I always tell people you should stop when you still have something to say, just a little bit, but then go back and like you did and just kind of keep spiraling it along, because that's one way to keep it growing, is to not sort of get stopped at some point. Just go, I don't have anything left to say.
Another really important part of the process for me, a lot of people, again, will write their book, revise it, and then send it to someone for comments and so on. And I was seeking comments on a regular basis. I have a lot of people that I know that were happy to read and make comments and suggestions and criticisms as I went along.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I liked this book in particular because I also saw it kind of early on also. And just the way you tied, because I think if you tell someone I wrote a book on philosophy, a lot of your philosophy friends will be excited to read it, but other people will be like, oh man, it's like telling kids in junior high they're going to read poetry. They have such a preconceived negativity about it, they don't want to touch it. But in your book, you absolutely bring in real life stories about how this all works together. And so that, I think, is the key to making it more than just an academic book. And so you're really teaching people how they can go about and become more realist, more real in their own lives. And I love that. And the chapter headings are crucial to that one, or the section headings are definitely crucial to yours as well.
So you hit on an interesting point. People kind of have this stereotype of what it means to write philosophy or what it means to read philosophy,
Right.
and a lot of people would dismiss it out of hand.
Mhm.
How do you sort of combat that?
Oh, well, you're not asking me. I can tell you in a second. But I mean, it's just from us talking now. I'm already inspired to think about, I mean, life in general. Just like I want to become a better, more authentic to myself. And so I think the best way to find out about that, of course, is to go to people that have put a lot of thought into that, and the traditions that go behind the ideas that we live by.
Yeah. Well, philosophers, like people in most disciplines, in some ways are their own worst enemy in relation to the general public. Because in order to succeed at a high level in philosophy, you have to become more and more narrow, and the connection between what you're doing and what ordinary people might learn from gets really faded out. And so I very intentionally wrote a book that had a lot of personal stories in it and was meant for a lay audience. Plenty of technical stuff out there, including on this topic, but I think it's pretty inaccessible to most people, in part because of that specialization, in part because it becomes very jargon-laden. And it's like people sitting around telling stories. Philosophers know these stories so well that they don't have to explain the background when they're doing technical work. And I think that's very valuable, but I think one of the problems is, as you mentioned, well, philosophers don't seem to be connected to ordinary people. I think that's a huge mistake.
That's
Philosophy has always, in every culture, been a central part of the dialogue that's going on in a culture, and we need it badly in our political life, in our moral life, in our cultural life, which is where my book fits.
Well, I mean, the beginning of your book starts out, well, there's two sections in it that I think immediately call people into it. And one is, the first one, you talk about your course at Kirkwood on working. And so I don't think, I mean, that inherently brings people into it because that's what they're often in school for, is to figure out how, so you're tying philosophy in with work. And then I like I'm a nature person also, but I really like this section on calling, because I also feel that concept gets a bad preconceived thought also, that people just only think that has to be religion only. And I think that's a mistake that a lot of people fall into, and they miss out on this great concept. And I'm sure you can tell us more about it, but I mean, to me, your book brings in all those things.
Well, notice the title of the book is Becoming Real.
Right.
It's not
the
being
final
real.
point. Right.
And that's because, again, if you look at any cultural tradition, I'm doing Confucianism and Taoism in my course at Kirkwood. And both of those traditions understand that while we start off with a lot of given, we're pretty advanced kinds of creatures, and pretty quickly as young children we acquire identities and personalities and so on. But the process of becoming fully what we might be is a lifelong process in all sorts of different spheres and dimensions, whether it's our physical bodies, or our spiritual lives, our intellectual lives, and so on. There's no end to what we might become and explore. And again, that's part of the wonder and the joy of it, and it's also part of what's scary and burdensome.
Right, so when our kids ask us what we want to be when we grow up, we're not joking when we keep saying, well, I don't know what I'm going to do when I grow up. I'm going to become more real.
That's actually easier in our culture in some ways now, because if you ask people who study people's work lives, the experts now say that most people have 5 or 6 or 7 careers in their work life, not just different jobs, but whole career changes. That's very, very common. And so, who am I going to be? And I think that fits in with something very important, and that's Gardner's 7 intelligences, or 9, or however many he has. He keeps inventing new ones. But I think he's onto something important. We have different aspects to ourselves that all need to be developed in proper balance. And so some of us get way too much intellectual work and not nearly enough heart work or enough musical work and so on. And I think developing in all these areas is part of what becoming fully human is about.
I don't think I know who Gardner is. Is that
Howard Gardner at Harvard.
All right, and he's written a book that
on the 7 intelligences.
All right, cool. We'll read.
So you talked about how one of the key things that's attractive about this is the personal stories. How hard is it for you to sort of get personal in such a public forum in your writing?
Well, plenty of stories I didn't include. Okay.
Wasn't that personal?
No, that's a very difficult subject. I tried to make sure that the stories fit with the concept, that they supplemented and helped to exemplify. I had one story I told that I've gotten a lot of flack on, but in some ways it's my favorite story in the book. When I was working with emotionally disturbed teenagers up in Alaska, and I was a pacifist. I was there, I was doing alternative service to being in the war in Vietnam. And I had a young man who, we were working with and I was making progress with, but he reached a point where he really wanted to know, and he didn't say this, of course, we had to discern this, how much we cared for him, including him attacking me physically, just punching me and goading me and so on, wanting me to respond in kind, not because he was picking a fight, but because he was wanting me to say, okay, I care so much for you, I'm willing to give up on my pacifism, okay? Right. And a lot of people have been critical of me that I think I should have punched him. Well, I still think I should have punched him, and I think that would have been the best thing therapeutically.
Solution at the time.
Yeah.
Right.
So it was interesting to tell stories, and to be honest, part of why I told some of the stories I did is for my children. I wanted them to read those in the context of my philosophical journey, and I think it's been a very helpful part of our relationship.
Oh, absolutely, right. I mean, and people will read it, not just, I mean, your children will read it that way, but other people will read it that way also. I mean, just alone, the number of students you probably had in your life that will read it and learn more about you and realize some of the things that you've said will touch their lives too. Because I know I even have an example. One of my brother's son had taken, I don't think he had you, but he had your class working. He was like, yeah, I should read that book. I really like that class. I'd like to know more about how he put that together. So that's just a tiny example, but I know that people want to be in touch with these issues and learn more about how they can become more real.
Well, great. Well, Bob, thank you so much for joining us today. Are you doing any public readings from your book, or any sort of tours or anything?
Nothing on the horizon, but I would be happy to do that if we could figure out where it is.
We did put it into ebook form finally.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. See, you're advancing. You're becoming real.
I have a Twitter account too. We should probably start listing.
There you go. And so, what's your username on Twitter?
@IceCubePress.
@IceCubePress.
I'm trying to get 5 followers.
Right.
Turns out people don't like following.
Well, Bob, thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Well, my pleasure, Nick. Joy being here.
And we will, in a few more months, hopefully come back with another exciting episode.
Right.
Great.
Until then, become real. Right?
Thank you for joining us.